Hi, y'all. Welcome to the 5th live episode of DEI Unmasked Conversations That Bridge. My name is Leandra, and I'll be your host for tonight. And today we'll be discussing a critical topic, decoding racialized language and bias in performance reviews. Throughout our conversation, we'll explore how language influences perceptions, biases, and experiences in social work and workplace settings, specifically focusing on its impact on performance evaluations. But before we dive into today's episode, we'd like to make it clear that the views and opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved, us, and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization, company, or entity that we may be associated with. Our discussions are personal and meant for entertainment and informative purposes only. During this live, if you would like to utilize closed captions, we encourage you to do so. To enable closed captions, simply navigate to the settings on your viewing platform. And additionally, we value your participation and would love to stay connected. Please visit our LinkedIn page and follow us. While there, we encourage you to sign up for our email list once we've launched it. And by doing so, you'll receive timely alerts about our upcoming live sessions. And as always, DEI Unmasked is not just a podcast. It is an invitation to peel back the layers, reveal the depth, and engage in a transformative dialogue. So without further ado, let's unmask together. All right, y'all. In our first segment, we're going to discuss general language and social interactions at work. Language holds immense power in shaping our perceptions and our experiences. We often use a lot of phrases or expressions without necessarily considering their potential impact. Let's unpack just a couple of examples and how they may carry some racialized undertones or bias. One of them being, you lack executive presence or are not professional. You are so articulate given your background. Wow, you don't look like I expected after having only talked to me on the phone. Describing people of color as aggressive or intimidating, but describing their white counterparts as confident or driven or assertive. And giving more benefit of the doubt to or assuming more potential in white men versus people of color or women of color especially. As I turn the conversation over to our co-hosts, I'd also like to hear from our audience. What are some experiences with coded language in social and workplace contexts that you've experienced? How has language influenced your sense of belonging or inclusion? All right, co-hosts. Now that we've set the stage by discussing some influence of general language in social workplace contexts, let's dive a little deeper into the conversation. Considering what I've said so far, what are some other examples of common phrases or expressions that may carry racialized undertones or biases in your experiences?
I would definitely say something that I have heard more than once is, and usually it's from Black people or from white people, sorry, that I'm Black, but I'm not that kind of Black. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I don't understand what that means, because of course for Black people we're not a monolith. You know, there's a vast array of Blackness, which is why it's called Blackness. But I have commonly been told, you know, I've been called an Oreo, that, you know, I'm Black on the outside, but I'm white on the inside. Don't let the John Mayer t-shirt fool you. But I've heard that quite a bit. And it's something I have always struggled with, that concept to white people, that because they think I'm so articulate or well-spoken, that somehow makes me an anomaly as a Black person.
Absolutely. How are we quantifying what Blackness is? And similarly, like, as I mentioned earlier, like executive presence or what being professional is, like there are so many different ways that people are categorizing these different words and associating different people with these words. And I've always been really curious, like, what does Blackness mean to someone who is surprised about my Blackness? Like, what were you expecting when I walked into the room? And a lot of people don't really know how to answer that, because what they're expecting is some problematic stuff. How about our other co-hosts? What are some either racialized or biased language that you've experienced in the workplace or in your performance reviews as well?
I've experienced something similar as Tanasha. Everything from, you don't look the way you sound on the phone. Or I've actually had people actually say to me, "Oh, you're Black. I thought you were white," when they meet me after doing business with me over the phone. So, I mean, people are bold and brazen, and they don't really seem to care about what they're saying and how it may be coming off. But yeah, I've definitely heard that. I've definitely heard the Oreo comments growing up, just because I was not into maybe some of the same things that some of my peers were into. But definitely from childhood, I've had some similar experiences as Tanasha described.
Mm.
And then just one thing to add quickly to what Chrystal was saying. The other thing is when you have those experiences in whether it be in the workplace or at school, and then you go out into the world, but if people haven't listened to you speak, or they don't understand, they don't know that you have strong elocution, if you will, then you're treated as just a stereotypical Black person, which is where we're supposed to be expected to speak in all, slang. And I like to go back and forth, because the thing that's fun to me is I can show up and use whatever language I want to. It doesn't change my level of intelligence. It doesn't change my education. It doesn't change what's in my heart. None of those things change based on whether or not I use the word ain't. And sometimes some things just require an ain't. Or sometimes some things just require a not on today. Everything that comes out of my mouth does not have to be grammatically correct for the things that I am saying to have value. And so it's difficult when you deal with that dynamic in workspaces based on how you speak and present. But then when you go into other places, you also deal with the dynamic of just showing up in the room, which of course can take place at work as well. So it's kind of like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. It seems like in our times of glory, like we are seen as an anomaly, especially when it comes to like Black women. Like when we have great accomplishments or are so articulate or have published something, we're seen as this anomaly or an exception to the rule that people have about Black folks. But then in our times of failure or growth opportunities, we are the spokesperson for our group, as though we are suddenly a monolith, but only in our times of failure. And I think that that's a really peculiar phenomenon that happens. It's like, I am not a representative of my race or my queerness or my neurodivergence if I have achieved alone. But if I fail, goodness knows that is what all autistic people do, or all Black women do, or all queer people do. And that's so disorienting in so many ways. Chrystal, I saw you come off mute. I want to make sure I give you your time at the mic again.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to add that, and I want to be transparent. I think as a young person, I would say probably like high school age, going into college, I think I developed a complex where I knew I was different. I knew I spoke differently. I knew I had a different upbringing than a lot of my classmates, but I developed a complex to where I think I was trying to be overtly Black. So I was doing like trying to engage in a lot of the culture and a lot of the things, which, definitely is not a bad thing. The exposure wasn't a bad thing, but I feel like I did it to a point where I wasn't being my authentic self. It really took a lot of work as a young professional, like in my early 20s. It took a ton of work and a lot of deep diving and a lot of self analysis, a lot of hard work with my inner work, shall I say, to kind of come out of that and to be able to have kind of the duality of, yes, I can be who I am, and yes, I can also immerse myself in the culture and also just be comfortable there as well. So I'm not relegated to just being this one thing, this one dimensional thing or person. I can be whatever I want to be. If I want to use slang one day, I'll use slang one day. If I feel like using the King's English and I'll use it properly, I'll do that as well. And but yeah, as a young person, I remember feeling very, very confused in high school about where did I fit, where did I belong. I had created like a insecurity within me. And I'm thankful that I've had the resources over the years to kind of get over that.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to think, like, who would we become if we didn't rely so heavily on the approval of others or the fear of oppression from others? Because there's so much that I do to navigate the world trying to make sure that I am enough of this or not too much of that. And that is really taxing on your body and spirit. I'm going to transition us over to the next question, which of course is related because we're doing a podcast and we're talking about a topic. I wanted to ask y'all, how do these subtle cues, these biases, these little moments contribute to the perpetuation of stereotypes and biases? And what can individuals do to become more mindful of the language that they're using? Because often some of the things that people say, they really mean well. You're so articulate. Oh my gosh, I'm so surprised. Like it's a compliment to them and they don't know. What are some ways for people to be more mindful? And how can we be better allies in doing that?
Sure, I'll go. This is Courtney, everyone. So I think number one, it reinforces that behavior or that stereotype when it's commonplace, especially in workplace settings. So for example, if someone is like, this person is not a culture fit because let's just say they're bilingual and the primary language of that region or that organization, they do not speak as well or they are not as articulate, that does not necessarily mean that they're not a quote unquote culture fit. And so I think it's really just diagnosing and breaking apart, what does culture fit mean? What do these things mean? So culture fit is one, someone saying you're not professional enough to do a certain task or to receive some sort of promotion. What does that actually mean? Can we put some definitions around these terms? And I think without definitions and making statements like that, it can not only create some sort of negative culture in an organization, but it can also really affect that person or employee with their own self-perception of how they're viewed. And so, of course, that can lead to retention issues, that can lead to engagement issues. So I think even though, say what you will about unconscious bias training, but there's pros and cons, of course. But I do think that having that initial baseline understanding of just taking account of how you are processing and how you're making these mental shortcuts with understanding people around you, how you work with people around you, and that interpretation and how that comes into play with your daily interaction with people in the workplace can be so vital, especially when you are in a position where you can promote people or you have authority over groups of people. It's incredibly important to stop and be mindful of how you're interacting with those groups.
I so agree, Courtney. And it's incumbent upon organizations, people in positions of power, right, to look at this both individually in terms of the language that we use, but also as an organization, the language that we use, whether that's in the tools, in our documents, right, all of those places where this stuff is captured, where the language is enshrined, so to speak, right? So, everything to how our performance management systems are developed, from the language that's created in academic settings, in much less in practice settings, and how that sets a standard and who's creating that language, who's setting that standard, right? Because everything is around, like, if their construct is performance, then that construct is developed based on that person's concept of what it is, unless they are intentionally being very inclusive in that process. And we have to be the same way in terms of how we apply that within organizations. Have very explicit conversations around the language that we're using, the language we use at different, at all levels of the organization as well. And so that we're both looking at the language and then we're also looking at how they're utilized in these tools, because at each tool, say it's a rating scale. it's not just the language of each individual question, but also the anchors, for example, on how people are being rated, because those themselves can be interpreted differently depending on an individual's bias, right? So every single anchor on every single item, on every single right, all of that needs to be examined through an anti-bias, anti-oppressive lens if we're truly going to look at how we do this, not just at an individual level, which is important, but also at a systems level within organizations.
I feel like I wish I could just give you the flame
I
emoji, just whoop, like right there, like I can mentally pop it up for you. Because I think that, like you said it, I think that there are things that individuals can do, but so much of these microaggressions or so much about biases, it's systemic, and we can't rely just on individuals to change their individual behavior. There are things that need to be undone and relearned in the systems that already exist that allow for people to have a more even playing field, because the way that we're quantifying what smart means or what success means or what someone being driven or having potential or anything like that, like those are all so subjective. And if there's no way that we are calibrating what meeting expectations are, then that could be all over the map. Because if we're talking about meeting my own personal expectations, like I don't know about all that. That's an interesting and moving target. However, if I know the expectations from my supervisor, that shouldn't be the same kind of moving target as my own personal expectations. So I think it's really important and poignant that you brought up bias as it is like interpersonally, and as it relates to the systemic things that are bigger than just the individual. And for our next segment, we are going to talk a little bit more about bias, but I wanted to pause and see if there's any audience interaction. Chrystal, do you have anything from the audience? Oh, you're on mute.
There we go.
Welcome back.
I don't see many comments yet, but someone did say, very well said, Tanasha, when you were speaking earlier about your experiences and your take on it. Yeah, so we'll just keep going at this point.
Great. Sounds good. So we're going to do a quick level set about what unconscious bias is, and also a little quick brief microaggression refresher for those who don't know or who need to revisit. Unconscious biases are the learned beliefs and assumptions and associations that our brains make in our subconscious. Everyone has a variety of implicit biases that we use as mental shortcuts to process the world of information around us, and biases develop over time as we're exposed to more things. I think that a lot of folks think that we are intentionally choosing our bias and that we mean this, but a lot of these things are just happening in our brains as we are categorizing the world around us and just getting sensory input. But when we are talking about unconscious bias in the workplace, there are many, many examples, but some that come up fairly regularly and are great examples for this conversation are affinity bias, which is the tendency to connect more easily with people who share something in common with you. A lot of people bond over the same hometown, the same university, the same sports team, having worked at the same company, that thing that you share with one another. Just like often I unconsciously find myself feeling more comfortable in rooms where there are more people of color and I feel like I belong. Some people are inclined to like people who are like them. Similarly, beauty and attractiveness bias, believing that people that we think are attractive or beautiful are more competent or qualified for the job. Another one is the halo and horns effect. Once someone has done something really good or really bad on either end of the spectrum, then we're only imagining them as always good or always bad. Like once they've ruined it, like you can't see them the same ever again. And using one moment in this person's history as an indicator of who they are forever, whether that's for better or for worse. And then one that really comes up, especially when talking about racialized bias, is name bias, which is a preference for certain names, usually ones that are easier to pronounce for English-speaking white folks. So we're looking at the, at the Dans and Chads and the Smiths and McDonalds of the world versus names that folks would call more ethnic, at least in the United States. And then that's just a few examples of unconscious bias, and there are many resources out there to go in depth about the many other ways that we are categorizing people as we're making split-second subconscious decisions. But we also want to talk briefly about microaggressions, and those are usually a product of our unconscious biases, and they are the small, usually unintentional moments of prejudice and discrimination that are often, again, direct products of our unconscious biases, and they come in many forms, verbal and nonverbal, through our actions, our comments, and, as Greta mentioned, policies that undermine people's identities and experiences. Tanasha, I know you're our resident expert on bias and related things. Do you have anything to add to those definitions?
I would say another bias that I would definitely add, and those are all great ones that you selected because they pop up all over the place, that anchoring bias. So where we take that initial piece of information, it's like the saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, because people come up with their first impression of you within just the first few seconds of meeting you. And for a lot of people, that becomes an anchoring point. And so then no matter what you do after that, you could accomplish great things, and they may still think, well, yeah, but the first time I met her, she did, X, Y, Z. And so I have concerns there. And the big thing that I always remind people when I speak about bias, especially as it relates to a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, is the importance of recognizing that we all hold bias in our minds. Our brains are taking in information, stimuli constantly throughout the day. So our biases, they really are shortcuts. And having biased thinking isn't in and of itself bad. It's when you don't slow down your thinking to make less biased decisions that bias becomes an issue. But we all have biased minds. And it's a good rule of thumb that the quicker you arrive at that decision, the more likely it is that you have made a decision from a place of bias. And that is something that people have got to recognize and get comfortable with understanding and really slowing down their thinking. Question your beliefs. Think about the role that the organization you work in, the society that you live in, plays in how you may view a particular person based on the color of their skin, based on their gender identity. Really stop and think about those things when you're engaging with someone and you're going to be making decisions about what to say, what not to say. So it's really just being intentional, because, we have intent and we have impact. But at the end of the day, impact matters more than intent, because there are a whole lot of people who say that they have positive intentions and they have a very harmful impact. Positive or good intent does not outrule having a harmful impact for someone. So that's why we have to really slow down that thinking and really be intentional in our decision making and how we interact with people.
Tanasha, I just wanted to say you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say the same exact thing that, and I've seen it. I've done plenty of DEI trainings for groups. And I think when we talk about biases, people automatically take offense. They think that, I'm doing something that's bad. Everybody has biases. I have biases. You have biases. Some of them are conscious. Some of them are not. It's a human thing. It's a human trait. And I think if more people would both understand that and keep that in mind when it concerns biases, it's not a personal attack against you as a person. It's a human thing. We all do it. Like you said, Tanasha, the way the brain works, it's a shortcut. I think that we probably could kind of like cover more ground with kind of getting rid of some of these microaggressions and macroaggressions. To be honest, I think people do those as well, and they're not really thinking about the total and impact of, I'm going to, this person did this one thing and I think badly of them now. Why not give this person grace? Maybe it was a learning experience for them. Maybe they weren't quite thinking it through. There could have been other external factors affecting them that caused them to make this mistake or caused them to act this way. So I think that we as a society would be a whole lot better off if we could just all remember that we all have biases regardless of race, creed, religion, sexual orientation, so forth and so on. I think people should just not take it so personally when we talk about biases. It doesn't mean I'm attacking you. It means we're just talking about what's out there and how can we all correct it.
Absolutely. Having biases doesn't mean that you are automatically a bad person. I think that like if you decide, like if you have seen your biases and you decide that you are going to continue forward with these biases, then maybe we're going to reevaluate the good personhoodness. But again,
That's
good
different.
personhood is different, and it's also so relative. But I think like when I think about these biases, like yes, there are these racial microaggressions, but I was thinking about how I was talking to a friend who is interviewing folks for a position that they have open, and someone was like 7 minutes late to their interview, and they were like, if this person is 7 minutes late to the interview, they don't care about the job, they're going to be late, they don't take my time seriously. And it's so easy to jump into those conclusions because we assume that because of either an experience that we've had before or because of how we value our own time, or that this person is disrespecting us in some way, or we're putting value statements on one moment in their history. And there are so many reasons to be 7 minutes late, though I don't encourage being 7 minutes late. Chances are the interviewee is just as horrified as you are. And also, like, looking at other experiences, I think that there are times where people have certain experiences with people or certain environments where if they had an experience that was less than wonderful, it's like, I don't want to interact with that type of thing ever again. So when I was a kid, I got bucked off of a horse, and now I don't really like horses all that much. But that doesn't mean that every single horse is the worst horse ever. It just means that I'm suddenly distancing myself a little bit further. And I feel like people often treat each other that way, where it's like, if I had a negative interaction on the subway with someone of a certain demographic, now I'm going to be afraid or think that this type of demographic of people is sketchy forevermore. I'm going to cross the street when I see, a person of color approaching me, or I'm going to, go a little further into the corner of the elevator. And those are all based off of real experiences that we have, but then our brain wires us to be afraid of people that we don't need to be afraid of, or to think that people are threatening or less smart or less capable because of the ways that we have built these associations on real experiences that we're having. And so, yeah, it's really interesting how we need to be really mindful of unlearning, but so much of the knowledge of biases is put, or like I guess the gravity of biases is put on the people that are experiencing them. And I think that there are people who are able to navigate their worlds not having to ever think about it. So a question that I have for our audience and for our co-hosts is like, what are some ways that we can handle some of these situations? And like, how do we become more cognizant of some of these biases and microaggressions when we aren't necessarily required to think about them, or if we're swimming in water that doesn't question our professionalism or our smarts or our blackness? Like, how do we become more cognizant when the world doesn't require us to in certain bodies?
I think one of the most common biases, and you mentioned it, the affinity bias and the ways that it shows up, and one of the most, and is one of the most self-perpetuating in the workplace, right? So that effect that we're most comfortable with people who are most like us. And when you consider and think about who's making the hiring decisions, who's making the recruiting and hiring decisions, right? And the way that those processes are put into place. So depending on who's doing the interviewing, who's going to be the most, I'm the most comfortable with this person, and maybe I can't define it. And the fact that we continue to perpetuate this, because not enough places have processes in place that are meant to combat this, because we know this. We've known this forever, that this is just a fact. I mean, we all have and some sort of affinity bias. And what matters is what we do with that bias when we're in positions of power. We're in positions to make those decisions about other people and their welfare in the workplace. So, okay, I know that this is the easiest this may be the easiest conversation for me to have, but what tools are we using then as an organization during those processes to combat those biases, so that we're using, setting criteria and using those criteria for those conversations, say it's hiring conversations, those interviews, and that we're doing our best to structure the process so that we're getting feedback from a variety of folks, from a variety of different lenses, experiences, parts of the organization, and that each one of those is structured sufficiently so that they're asking the same questions and getting the same data, so that they're comparable. It's qualitative data, yes, but still, we want to do the best that we can. So, that we're comparing apples to apples in the best sense that we can, and that we're also bringing multiple perspectives to that process, different interviewers, so that in that breakdown process, we're also getting multiple perspectives on what that response meant, right? Because they may be giving the same response to different people and it's heard different ways. So building all of these aspects into it, knowing we have these biases, so that we're intentional about getting the same information, but processing it through multiple lenses and being aware of that, when we're doing that, and when we're formalizing that at various stages of the employee life cycle.
And I think everything that you just said, it was so great and all encompassing, Greta. And as you were talking, the thought occurred to me. It's one of those things where it's the difference between an opinion and an educated opinion. And that is a big, big difference, because what Greta was really just talking about is having the tools so that you can form an educated opinion on things. So you can make sure that you're removing bias from your performance review process in as much as you can. Because I will say wholeheartedly, one of the things that I see, and one of the things that has been a struggle for me, is the more educated I have become, the more people, specifically white people, who are less formally educated than I am, like to challenge me. And it's like, well, if I can make this person who has these 2 master's degrees look like they don't know what they're talking about, then that suddenly makes me smarter. But there's a big difference between an opinion and an educated opinion. And when you look at mindset, an opinion is very fixed mindset thinking. You have a belief, you hold on to that belief. You could be engaging in a confirmation bias. So anything that's factual that goes against the belief you hold, that's just a random belief, you dismiss those facts because they go against the belief that you have. But if you're operating from a growth mindset, from that builder mindset, the whole point is to learn, to build knowledge, to build understanding. Just like you were saying earlier, Leandra, about unlearning, because it's not just taking in new information, it's unlearning the things that have been taught. And that's true in society. That's true within organizations. There's unlearning that's involved, and it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary if you're trying to get to a place where it is a more diverse, a more inclusive, a more equitable organization for the people who are there. So it's really just learning that just because you have an opinion doesn't always make you right. And being able to defer to people who can come in the door with knowledge and expertise that you may not have. Because that's a true sign of intellect, is wanting to learn from people who can teach you things instead of just dismissing it because it challenges your worldview. If my experience as a Black person challenges somebody's worldview and they're not Black, well, how is that my problem? It's not, because I still have those same experiences as a Black person, whether they believe it or not.
Ain't that the truth?
Well,
Leandra,
I have a couple of comments in the oh, I'm sorry, Courtney, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to quickly say that in organizations, that employee manager relationship is so crucial. And when we think about allies, what I think about just immediately is a covering or a supporter And your manager should be that for you. So end of the year performance review should never be a surprise. You should never sit down with your manager and say, oh, well, I didn't know any of this. Okay, thank you for telling me how you feel. You should know even before the review, because you should have a continuous dialogue with your manager. And as a manager, you should be promoting your people, and you should also be just advocating for them. So for example, if there's a meeting and someone mentions, okay, this person is not assertive enough, or the project they're working on was easy because they were a part of it, and they're promoting some sort of stereotypical language, as a manager, it's your job to step in and intervene and say, no, this person may need coaching as it relates to being open and speaking in meetings, and that person may not feel comfortable, and that's okay. But as a manager, it's your job to coach said person on areas where they may have a weakness. And it's also your job to address the harmful language that was said in the meeting, by being honest and very upfront, and even thinking about training for your team if that's something that happened, and saying, this is something that happened. It's something that we would like to address because we basically have a no nonsense policy, or whatever the case could be. So it's that manager taking that initial step and being that covering for the employee or the worker to make sure that it is a safe working environment without any toxicity. I think another aspect of being an ally from a manager perspective is also setting those clear expectations. And then also just taking time to educate yourself. So what people work for me, what's their experiences, what's their background, how can I get to know my people? So building that relationship. And a lot of times when you build relationships with people, people will be open and they'll feel more comfortable advancing and growing in their roles, which is incredibly important to continue to promote a positive culture. So I think just starting there, and number one, being mindful. Number two, understanding, appreciating, and being responsible for the authority that you hold. And then also working, and not everyone, of course, there's some sort of a learning curve, obviously, but making sure that everyone on your team is understanding the boundaries that you set and the clear expectations that you have as well as an organization. So it's really important who we hire into our organizations, especially those that are in managerial positions.
Absolutely. I think that it's really important to acknowledge as well that our biases often impact who we give our time to as well. So with affinity bias, it's like if you have the same sports team that you like, or you share that your kids play soccer on the same team, or whatever that is that connects you to each other, often that is a segue into conversing about, how did you catch the game last night? How about the Raiders, whatever the thing is. And then those conversations sometimes organically go into what are you working on recently? And then suddenly I'm the person that's getting tapped on the shoulder for a project because I happen to like the Raiders the way my supervisor does, because we have a reason to talk more often. And I think that it makes sense to want to forge these connections based on things that you have in common with your coworkers. And, building that rapport is important. However, it cannot be the basis on which we're giving exceeds expectations or giving promotions or giving these opportunities, because I don't want to know that the reason why I'm progressing in my career is because I share the same love for Beyonce. I want to know it's because of because I have done the work to get there. And I think so often people of color have to work really hard to try and fit the culture of the space that they're trying to gain access to, while there are other people who are just being mediocre and don't have to really think about all the different ways that they need to fit in, or the extra things that they need to learn about in order to have something to talk about when suddenly people are talking about, the World Cup or whatever it is that people are talking about. I give sports as a reference often because there are a lot of sports that I don't know a lot about that people talk about often. And I'm like, oh, I should read more about that thing just so I can be a part of the conversation, knowing that maybe there's a happy hour that I will get invited to because I know enough about insert college team here. So I think it's really important to remind ourselves that our biases often result in us putting in more emotional and social labor into people that are like us. And that results in a lot of people who are not like us getting left behind. And often the not like us in a corporate space is people of color, queer folks, neurodivergent folks, women. Chrystal, I saw you come off mute. Do we have some more audience engagement happening over there?
We do. I want to shout out Monica. Is it Katri or Katri? I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. She is totally engaged with us. Thank you for engaging in our conversation. So she's got a couple of comments in here. She agreed, Courtney, with what you said about setting the expectations as a leader with your team. She says individuals must also understand the need to unlearn as needed. Educated opinions are unfortunately lacking. Continuous feedback, not just end of year performance reviews, is critical. I think, was it you, Courtney, that had made that statement? Safe space, allowing for open dialogue is critical. It's important to understand without emotional intelligence, there's an absence of the ability to recognize the importance of bias and the impact of microaggressions. So thank you so much, Monica, for engaging in this conversation with us, because we definitely want to get input for the audience. We want to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, any challenges that you may be presented with. We want to, have a full dialogue with you all. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I appreciate it, and good to see you in the audience. It is so important to talk about that piece of emotional intelligence. I think that for some people, it feels like this innate thing where it's like emotional intelligence, of course. But for some people, when you don't have to think about it and you don't have to, like, you're operating through the world safely, emotional intelligence isn't something that's necessarily required, because you are often praised for all of the other skills that you bring into a space other than empathy or emotional intelligence. But I know that we only got an hour, so I want to make sure that I get to our last segment, which is talking a little bit more about the actual performance review process. And so let's segue here. Performance reviews are really subjective, as we have talked about more than once here. They're informed by the biases of the reviewer, and these reviews then become a part of the employee's record or history at a company, and sometimes in their career. So I want to ask the co-host, what are some examples of coded language manifesting in performance reviews, and how does that affect people down the line? If a future manager at the same company is saying that, like, oh, Leandra is... instead of like, Leandra seeks clarity, Leandra is exceedingly negative and asks too many questions, or Leandra is bossy versus assertive. How are y'all seeing some of this language popping up in performance reviews? I know that we're reiterating a little bit of what we talked about earlier, but how does it show up in performance reviews, especially down the road? Like, how does the performance review I got on Tuesday impact my job further down the road?
It looks like we're all ready. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I was like, I feel the silence, but it seems like the silence of anticipations. Who's gonna go first? So, Courtney, I'm going to call on you first, and then let people jump in after that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, this is really a loaded question, Leandra, because when you think about performance reviews, that's usually connected to some sort of pay rise or some sort of promotion or advancement in an organization. So if you're receiving feedback from your manager and there is no action associated with your performance review, and you receive something that says, great job, great work, very interactive, very engaging, those comments are wonderful. They make you feel very excited and probably fluffy inside, but there's really no context to that. So there's really no way that I can improve my performance because I'm just receiving nice notes, really nice nothings, if you will, because they're not really going to go anywhere. So that's one side. I think another side is a lot of times we see that folks from marginalized communities don't receive those actionable language a lot of the times. And so that does really hinder the advancement of some people from the backgrounds that you were speaking about a little earlier, Leandra. Also, I think sometimes words like executive presence can be used or tossed around. And a lot of times it's associated with a certain type of person. And so that can also hinder someone else's advancement in an organization if they don't necessarily, quote unquote, look the part of the role. So that's something else to consider, and not focusing on the person, but focusing on their performance. So being able to separate the two. And again, this is where the unconscious bias comes in, and just focusing on the fruit that the person has created versus, how you feel about them. If they chew loud at lunch, that's not something that you should take into account as you're giving them their performance review. So really, those are the two main areas where I see probably could be some gray in terms of advancement, and also where biases or coded language come into play when giving a performance review. Also, I will just put this back in there. Maybe Tanasha or Greta, whoever was unmute, can maybe chew on this a little bit more. But when you think about performance reviews, like Monica said, they should not just be at the end of the year. So how can we have these continuous talks or conversations with our employees or workers to help them grow and advance while still interjecting that inclusive, actionable language that can help certain demographics of people move up in an organization? So that's always something to ponder and consider. So kind of a two-pronged question, Leandra. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Courtney.
I was going to say, just kind of piggybacking on what you were saying, Courtney, one of the things that's important when you're thinking about Monica's point and what you were saying, Courtney, about not finding out at the end of the year, and the importance of regular, productive communication with your employees when you're in a leadership role, is the importance of those one-on-ones. And I have been in roles where I had regular one-on-ones, like bi-weekly one-on-ones. Some places they prefer to have weekly one-on-ones. My husband is in tech, and so he does like daily check-ins with everybody because they do stand-ups and all this other kind of agile stuff. But just the importance of really having that very regular communication with your team when you're in a leadership role, and the importance of asking and letting them know that you really want to receive feedback from them, and not in a way where it's going to be punitive if they speak up. Because one of the issues I faced in recent years was standing up for myself at work about things that were happening, microaggressive comments. I'm like, I can't assert myself because I'm a Black woman. So I have to be mindful about that. And I had someone in a senior role, like top 5 in one of my former organizations, in the top 5 of this hundreds and hundreds of people organization, look me in my face and tell me that, I didn't need to worry about being stereotyped. And I was like, what? So this is the one organization I've been in my whole decades long career where, as a Black woman, I'm not going to be stereotyped. Oh, so the angry Black woman trope won't apply here. But then, as soon as I started speaking up and pointing out things that really were areas of concern in terms of how I was being treated in those corporate spaces, where I was oftentimes one of, if not the only, Black person in those spaces, then all of a sudden you could notice things starting to tend towards me being treated like I was somehow being aggressive just for saying I didn't want to be treated in a certain way. Like I was pulled into what was supposed to be communication training. And I'm just going to say, as somebody with a whole entire degree in communication, talk about things that I just found to be really, really disrespectful. And it wasn't that the culture was an issue or that how I was being spoken to was an issue. It was just that I didn't understand how I needed to communicate in that space. And I was like, okay, well, this is the time where I start mentally drafting my letter of resignation, because I just couldn't work under those conditions. But it's that thing where, like I was saying earlier, about really needing to believe people when people speak up, and when you're in a leadership role and you're doing it in a way that's beneficial for the people on your team, they will not only feel comfortable coming to you and sharing things with you, pointing out coded language that may be used towards them, sharing microaggressions that they may be experiencing, and then you can show up for them as an ally by taking what they say seriously and taking actionable steps to help resolve that, so they don't have to continue to deal with that kind of behavior. Because that's when you see people who are driven out of organizations. Like, there's a reason I left corporate America, and the cost of working while Black, it was just too much. I just couldn't take it anymore. And it's a sad thing to see people, and I know multiple people, especially Black women in our current climate, who are trying to decide how they're going to take care of themselves with all of their education, but not have to sacrifice their mental, emotional, and physical well-being. Because it's hard to go to an employer where you're essentially told that you need to leave your self-respect at the door for a paycheck. Like, no one wants to work that way. Like, it's just not beneficial. And so it's really incumbent upon leaders to make sure that they're showing up for their teams in ways that help people feel seen, heard, and valued, which means when we see something, when we say something, when it happens to us, you do something about it. You don't just treat it like, well, we just didn't understand, because that in and of itself is gaslighting.
Two people came off mute at the same
I'm
time
living
again.
for your
I saw you
expressions right now, Leandra. I just want you to know that. Your expressions. I'm getting my full life over here.
I can't fix my face ever.
Gosh, you guys have said so much already. There's so much there. But, one of them is, also ensuring, yes. So performance reviews, performance management should not be a one-time a year thing, right? There should be systems that are built in. Absolutely. It also needs to be, one of the things that we also need to build right around this is, looking at the factors of what creates a psychologically safe environment for these conversations to happen over time. What are we doing and how are we educating our managers, our leaders, and the team members themselves to actually create these environments so that, at least to the best of our ability, where we are currently in our development, we're doing our best to create environments where people can ask questions, where people can make mistakes in the learning process, where people can innovate, where people can make changes, where people can be transparent in communication, where people can challenge the status quo, right? These are the levels, kind of, if you agree with that kind of stages view of psychological safety. That continuous feedback is part of that process, that it's consistent, that people are transparent, that it's consistent across employees. So like we said, not just certain employees are getting that same treatment. And as much as emotional intelligence is a piece of this, I would also add intercultural competence is critical for all of the folks, especially the folks in power. It's true for everybody, but especially for folks who have control over making some of these decisions, because it impacts our capacity, our mindset impacts our capacity to understand these things. It's not just EQ, but right? What is our capacity for understanding the nuance and cultural differences? So we're looking not just at the commonalities we have between us to get by, which is where affinity bias comes in, but we're also be able to look at and understand the differences between us to allow space for those differences, so that we're coming into those conversations with openness and curiosity, right? And some humility to be open to the things that we don't necessarily understand, to be able to sit with that discomfort, especially when we're in managerial and leadership roles and we're told we're supposed to know everything, right? We don't. None of us do. It doesn't matter what level we're at, right? So that's also an important component that people need to look at. And we also need to be looking at the data, because if we're not looking at the data, granted, this depends on the size of your organization, and looking at differences. So if we're looking at big picture data and we're looking at the demographics and who's getting reviewed at what level, right? So that we're breaking down that data, so that we're looking at, what are the differences in reviewers, for example, because there's lots of terrible research out there on the quality of performance management because they didn't break down the data sufficiently to they were saying there isn't any rater bias in performance appraisals. Well, that's because they didn't look at the difference in the same person when the rater was white versus when the rater was Black, not just the person being rated. We have to look at the nuances as much as we're looking at, the big picture stuff, when we're looking at the data, when we're looking at the individual level stuff as well. It's complicated. It's a lot. We're not going to make those changes all overnight. And every piece of that is critical to being able to treat people the way they deserve to be treated, as well as advance our organizations by getting the best people into where they belong in an organization so that they can bring their best selves, bring their skills, to the work. Sorry, all it was pent up. I had a lot to go.
I mean, another mic drop. I feel like we've had a lot of fire in this episode. So yeah, no sorries here. I'm gonna thank you instead. Thank you for that moment.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Chrystal, are there any comments from the audience? I know that we are closely running out of time here, so I want to make sure that we check in on them.
Yes. Let's see. Monica, she said many times as leaders, simply asking, "Are you okay?" in one-on-ones can shed a light on a number of issues. And I wholeheartedly agree with her on that, because you may find out that they've got some sort of extreme personal matter going on that's affecting performance. Like, instead of assuming that they're blowing off the job or that they're trying to quietly quit or whatever, find out, exactly what's going on with them as a human being. Find out maybe they need an additional tool at their disposal to be able to do their job. It could be a myriad of things, but just asking somebody how they're doing and actually listen for the response. I wish a whole lot more leaders would definitely do that. So thank you for that, Monica. Crystal Rogers, she said, "I resonate with Tanasha. It's amazing that this toxicity exists across the board." And then Monica said that the book that you held up, is it A Color of Emotional Intelligence? She said that's a fabulous book. So yes, by Farrah Harris. I'll have to add that to my library too. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And I agree with the regular reviews or check-ins with supervisors. I think that supervisors should never feel super caught off guard by the departure of one of their employees, nor should employees ever feel be taken off guard by their performance reviews. Like, why? I feel like so many people are like, "Oh my gosh, if I had known sooner, I would have changed something." Why aren't we communicating sooner then? I think that's something to remind ourselves of, is like, this feedback, we shouldn't stew on it. We shouldn't give it another 6 months. Like, if there is feedback that's going to help someone's performance now, and we are their supervisor and we are given the responsibility and the privilege of sponsoring and advocating for someone in their career, then we should be doing so all year round, not just when review season comes up. And I think it's important to also remember that our words have a lot of gravity. So as Tanasha mentioned, the word aggressive. What does aggressive mean? And if supervisors down the road see that my first supervisor at a company called me aggressive in my review, how is that going to affect me as a Black woman versus like be aggressive for like a white person? Like aggression, it looks very different when depending on what audience you're speaking to and who you're calling aggressive. So that is, you know, our words have a lot of impact, and I think it's really important that we are considering that regardless of our intent. But with that, y'all, I want to thank you as we have completed another live episode of DEI Unmasked, the conversations that bridge. A huge thank you to our audience for your engagement and participation since our launch, especially. Your insights have enriched our conversation and perspectives. We look forward to continuing this journey with you. As we close today's episode, remember, the journey towards equity and inclusion is ongoing, and each of us plays a vital role in driving positive change. Let's continue these conversations, challenge stereotypes, and advocate for a more equitable future. Don't forget to follow us, DEI Unmasked Conversations That Bridge, on LinkedIn for future episodes, and keep the dialogue alive on social media using our hashtag DEI Unmasked. Thank you once again for unmasking with us today. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and keep unmasking the world around you. Bye, y'all.